take your seats. We're going to have our third session. It is entitled The State, the New Leaders, and the Old Institutions. We have some distinguished speakers, and we think its session is of particular importance. First of all, it's Prince Turki bin Faisal Al Saud. Officially, he is president of King Faisal Foundation, also chairman of the Center for Research and Islamic Studies of King Faisal Center. We know him as a well-known statesman of Saudi Arabia. His name is well known. Your Excellency, I'm pleased to give you the floor.
Thank you, and Dr. Naumkin, for the invitation to speak to this distinguished audience. And I greet also my fellow panelists. I hope our discussions will be somehow helpful in these times of stress. The conference title is a challenge in itself. Middle East in Search for Lost Awakening. The title does not specify which awakening, though the last 100 years, our Arab region went through many stages of developments and were called awakenings. Seeking independence from the Ottoman Empire, gaining independence from foreign occupations and mandates, the rise of Arab nationalism, the rise of Islamism, and lastly, the Arab Spring, were all called by many as awakenings. However, all these developments were part of a historical accumulative process of searching for national and regional arrangements that respond to the aspirations of the people of the region. The process of remaking the Middle East after the First World War, particularly the Arab world, resulted in the dominance of the nation-state model. Therefore, and despite shared factors such as language, religion, and history, many states emerged. Different political, economic, and social paths were adopted. The political elites that inherited the colonial systems chose different paths to their country's political developments. They did not have the space to settle on a particular political system or sustainable constitutions and political institutions. Some had revolutions, and some had military coups and entered a state of continuous instability. They therefore did not allow their countries to achieve normal political development and respond to the aspirations of the people and bring the required stability to achieve economic, social, cultural, and scientific development. Military coup d'etats brought several leaders who, while promising to ameliorate the condition of their people, instead developed personal cults that relied on coercive and oppressive means to ensure their political survival and primacy. Ideologically alien political parties adopting then voguish brands of socialism and communism achieved their political primacy through coup d'etats led by ambitious military officers, and when they came to power, either the officer or the party forcibly removed them from power. Again, coercive and oppressive measures became the norm, and the people suffered from Baghdad to Nouakchott. Many monarchies, however, were better at developing stable political systems responding to their own political cultures. Succession was smooth in monarchical states. Each new leader continued building on the earlier accomplishments of his predecessor. Evolution and moderation were their strategy in advancing the interests of their countries and their people. Regardless of the nature of the political systems of each Arab state, the order of nation-states has sustained itself during the last 100 years. The nation-state today, for most people, is the point of reference of national identity, national development, national ambitions, and national futures. However, strategically, the Arab non-states, nation-states, are vulnerable on many fronts and are widely exposed to all possibilities. This strategic vulnerability is as old as the establishment of the nation-states order in the region following the First World War. Coupled with this is the failure of many of our states in facing the shared and constantly looming threats to our existence and to our people. Poor social, economic, educational, and cultural policies and selfishness that characterize policies in these fields are causes of the mess that we are in. Upheavals, instability, and the imbalance in state level is but an unavoidable result of political miscalculation and wrong course of action, whether internally or externally. These policies are the cause of what happened and is happening in Iraq, for example, leading to becoming an almost failed state with a collapsing society. The cause of Syria's free falling into a swamp of blood, destruction, desolation, terrorism, conspiracies, and foreign interventions. The cause of the sinking of Yemen into an inferno of conflict, civil war. The cause of the failure of the Libyan state and unrest in many other countries. The cause of the spread of transnational phenomena, such as terrorism within many of our states. The cause of the spread of armed militias that are not under the control of national states, and the spread of appalling sectarianism and other negative phenomena, especially the ones supported by Iran. All that is a condensed representation of the challenges facing some of the Arab states. These challenges facing our Arab states arise from the sharp polarization of the new political and social movements because of the contemporary political transformation and the spread of politicized primal inclinations, whether they are religious, sectarian, and tribal, which were hitherto suppressed. They are the most serious threat which faces the Arab states and could lead to new traps that could endanger their national security. Foreign interventions and policies enacted by the leaders of Iraq led to chaos, instability, and the prevailing sectarianism. What we are witnessing in Syria of constant bloody struggle and tragedy and mayhem is a testimony to the utter failure of the Syrian leadership to manage the state's affairs, leading also to intervention by foreign powers, which are keen only on safeguarding their own strategic interests. And here, since I am talking in a Russian forum, I may, as a friend, quote an Arab saying which goes like this: "Your friend is he who tells you the truth, not he who tells you what you want to hear." Russian military intervention was justified by declared goals, preserving the threatened Syrian state and fighting terrorism. This was understandable, taking into consideration the historical relations between the two countries. The Arab League proposal, which Russia vetoed, would have preserved the state. However, now the Russian intervention is more and more seen as preserving a failed political regime under a failed leadership that led the Syrian people into the state of disaster that they are occupying now. I'm afraid that the justified purpose of the Russian intervention will, in the end, cause the disintegration of the state. If the intention is not clarified by finding a political solution to this tragic conflict to preserve the Syrian state and achieve the Syrian people's aspirations with a regime of their own choice, I may say the same thing about the Turkish and Iranian interventions in Syria. Today, alas, Syria is a colony of three powers, and it is ironic that historically Syria was the linchpin ideologically and emotionally of the anti-colonial movement in the Arab world. The situation in Libya and Yemen is replete with examples of order breaking down, leading to their being failed states. The collapse of these important national states in the Arab world is not in the interest of the people of the states, nor in the interest of regional peace and security. Preservation of the nation state is of vital importance to the security and stability of its social components. Realization of such a goal cannot be achieved without avoiding many of the policies which guided many aspects of development and without creating a normal relationship between the state and its citizens, whereby the state is the guardian of all of the society with all of its shades and colors, attending to its ambitions and aspirations. I must also refer to the Palestinian problem as being an example of failure and making for the nation state in the Arab world. The resolution of that problem will not resolve all of the problems in the Middle East, but it will go a long way to removing the placard and the flag that non-state actors raise now, calling for the liberation of the Palestinian people from Israeli occupation. We must strive to restore Arab states which are collapsing and help their societies to overcome this perilous stage, new social contracts that can save from present miseries, restore their hopes, and fulfill their ambitions and the expectations of their people. Russia's duty is to play a role in this, especially in the Syrian case, to return the Syrian state to its rightful owner, the Syrian people. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you so much, Your Royal Highness. I'd like to say that at the previous sessions also we touched upon the Syrian question, and we said that the Arab nations may play a big role, and a very quick role, first of all in the political settlement in Syria, and secondly in restoration of Syria as an independent and holistic integral state, especially now when the Syrians are going through lots of hardships. Once they have shortage of medications and food. Anyway, thank you so much, Your Royal Highness, and I hope that your contribution caused a lot of interest in the participants. There will be more questions, so you'll be looking forward to more questions. We have 4 speakers to come, and afterwards we'll have Q&A session. Thank you so much. Saying that, I'd like to pass the floor to a person from another country. Mustafa Aydin, President, International Relations Council of Turkey. That's a person whose name is very well known, not only in Turkey and in the Middle East, but also in Russia and all over the world. Over to you.
Thank you very much. This is a great pleasure to be able to speak to Valdai conference again. Although, unfortunately, we are not able to travel to Moscow at this time. Nevertheless, I'm very happy.
Probably next time. Probably next time.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to share my thoughts with you online. Let me start by emphasizing that both the Middle East in general and the Arab world is facing tremendous challenges, both from within their own states and out of the region. It's not only the regional issues, but international affairs also pressuring down the Middle Eastern Arab countries. The challenges are so complex as they have local, national, regional, and global dimensions, which necessitates similarly complex responses. However, the diagnostics of the challenges so far in the region as a whole and for individual countries have been very simplistic, have been from a very simplistic perspective, that of a security and stability of the region or the governing of elites in individual countries. As a result of these simplistic diagnostics, the responses so far have been haphazard and not really dealing with the core issues, which remains more or less intact. When I talk about these issues that remain intact are shifts in dynamics of identity politics in the region, the resultant polarization and extreme fragmentation of the societies within various countries, demographic, ecological, and economic pressures on state structures and societies, and finally, governance problems and demands for more rights and freedoms from the citizens of the countries in the region. All of these culminate in a question of legitimacy of governments and states and the ruling elites in many of the countries in the region, which are mostly identified with weak sovereignties, both internally and externally. Trying to deal with all these problems from the perspective of security and stability versus good governance and democratization have led to weakening of institutions in many countries with external pressures, and at the same time in a contradictory trend to strengthening of state apparatus in many other countries. This dichotomy of strong state apparatus with weak institutions and weakening legitimacy does not bode well for the future of the region. It leads to further suppressions, militarization, heightened national and sectarian identities, and as a result, in the longer run, exaggerating, not solving the many of the problems that the region is facing. With internationalization of all these issues and the problems, the stage is set for the next round of conflicts between the forces of change and transformation, supported with outside involvement, and the forces of conservatism and traditionalism, usually promoted by local state elites. In 2011, Arab uprisings exaggerated conflict and turmoil in the region, with the civil war in Syria constituting the dominant event in the region since then, drawing surrounding countries into a destructive vortex. The changes brought by the uprisings have now intermingled with the pre-existing conflicts in the region. These developments, taken together, have seemed to further doubt on the legitimacy of the state that have defined the region over the past 100 years or so. I argue that to overcome this disorder and regain a degree of order in the region, the states need to undergo a degree of good governance, a degree of democratic governance. It is closely linked to the emergence of peace and security. This might seem a very mundane observation. However, the opposing point of view has so far prevailed in the region. It is seen that authoritarianism, not democratic governance, is a sine non qua for regional order and stability. However, what we have seen most spectacularly in Syria is that authoritarian regimes, by undermining society's capacity to negotiate conflicts peacefully, leads to instability and chaos, not only for themselves, but for the region also. Of course, I am not naive to advocate a full-blown democratic system here. Rather, what I interpreted is an entailing degree of pluralism, inclusiveness, and accountability that will allow for peaceful coexistence in domestic societies and adequate functioning of a given political system. The developments since 2011 have shown to us that prospects for good governance in the region is not very promising at the moment. The initial hopes of expectations have been crushed by internal conflicts, but also international interventions to the domestic affairs of the regional countries. The turmoil has accompanied with downturn in the process of good governance in the region. It does not imply that the order can be reconstructed through the restoration of authoritarian rule. The state system in the region, which has become problematic, nevertheless remains the only available framework for political organization. So we have to work with the existing state system. We have to, if we are going to avoid sectarianism and divisive explanations of centrifugal forces in the region, we have to, it seems, to rely on the state apparatus, nevertheless, of its problematic aspects. Looking to the future finally, let me say a few words. Whether it is possible to find a way to forward with a regional mechanism of security. A simple mechanism of communication between different actors in the region, not only between the state actors, but non-state actors also, seems to be essential, that need to be created to allow to move beyond non-recognition of various actors of each other. A multilateral fora might need to be created with opportunities to those who avoid bilateral dialogue. Role of non-state actors need to be recognized, obviously, while state sovereignty has to be accepted by all the involved actors, basing principles, becoming a basing principle to start with. Finally, we have to realize that we are operating within a world where frenemies are the norm rather than friends and or enemies. As a result, transactional cooperation based on states' instincts for survival and sovereignty might provide a way out in the absence of principles value-based cooperation. In this way, we might also avoid the need to wait for a new agent of an order to coerce or force regional states to cooperation, which might have been as the foundation of the current disorder in the region anyway. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mustafa Aydin. You know, you missed our previous sessions, but no, по-русски, но
Let me switch
многие...
to English. Many speakers before this session also spoke about fragmentation of the Middle East and the necessity to intensify the role of the states, and the experience of the past years only illustrates that. Thank you so much. Hope to see you personally in Moscow next time. Saying that, I would like to pass the floor to Khrer Balyan, Director, Conflict Resolution Program from Carter Center. Carter Center, which partners us for quite a while.
And thank you to the organizers for having invited me to such a to speak in such a distinguished panel. I too wish we could have been in Moscow to meet all together around a table and have this discussion, but that's going to have to wait for next year, I'm afraid. We've been asked to respond to about a dozen questions, all in the agenda in front of us. I'm afraid in 6 or 7 minutes that are allocated to speak in this panel to
У нас проблемы со связью.
We have some technical problems with communication.
Should I stop?
Please.
No, go on, go on.
Okay. I was just going to say that I apologize for having my video off because of the very, very weak internet bandwidth where I'm speaking, and I'm in Beirut this week on a business trip, my first in 1 year. But let me see if I can continue. The first question that I'd like to ask is the following. Is the Arab state changing? Are the political systems undergoing transformation? I'm afraid I have to be pessimistic here. As an observer of the Arab world, a good friend of mine just commented recently. He said the Arab region is suffering from a future deficit, quote unquote, future deficit. Dreams for an alternative and profoundly better future have been shoved aside in favor of very short-term goals of maintaining stability and security. Of course, very worthy goals, but that's not sufficient. They're not transformative long-term objectives. The exception, of course, is some of the Gulf states where we do see some thinking about the future and the long-term future. While it is dangerous to reduce a vast region with very rich cultural and historical diversity into a singular concept, or singular concepts in plural, some common patterns and trends cannot be ignored, namely high demographic growth, the so-called youth bulge. According to the World Bank, 2/3 of the population in the Arab world are under 30 years old. Think about it, 2/3 under 30, with very high unemployment for this strata of the large portion of the Arab world's population. Half the population, women, in too many Arab countries are completely marginalized, if not partly are marginalized. Climate change is coming to haunt us. Disproportionately high military spending is causing havoc, and many more ills that we can talk about. Transformation has indeed happened in the Arab world, but more substantive transformation has occurred in the relationship between states rather than within the states. Political dynamics in the region are increasingly represented by three regional power axes: Iran, Syria, the first axis; GCC, Israel, the second axis; and Turkey, Qatar, the third axis. The weakness for other Arab states and their political systems makes them susceptible to influence by the three non-Arab regional powers. For the internal political systems of the region, they are either undergoing limited transformation or none at all. At the same time, civic mobilization, in particular the youth in the Arab world, remains very strong, and which started about 10 years ago. The Arab streets are restless and are demanding dignity, fundamental rights, representative government, new social contracts between those who govern and the governed, between the security sector and the population at large, between minorities and the majority, between the center and periphery, between urban and rural populations, and more. Yet the political system in most of the MENA countries remain ossified, I'm afraid. Let me go to the second, my third question that I'd like to respond to, which is with respect to how the Arab world is influenced by crisis and conflicts. Let me turn the question around and respond by asking, what does it take to address multiple crises and conflicts in a region where a full half of the countries are in some level of political conflict or crisis, and half of those are failed or failing states? So what is missing? What are the missing ingredients for resolving these conflicts? Why are we having difficulty resolving these conflicts? I can identify four overarching ingredients that are factors in continuing the conflicts. The first, the absence of accommodating relations between identity groups, and by identity groups I mean national, sectarian, political, religious identity groups, and between identity groups and the state. Is there a dominant group in the country, given country, in the first place? Can the dominant group compromise, share power, accept others, and vice versa? Can a national or state identity prevail over group identities in a given country? The ingredient, how is the state addressing the deprivation of human needs? By human needs, I mean, I'm referring to the population's needs for security, development, political and cultural access, and more. And third, does the government have legitimate authority? And this is extremely important, as you can imagine. Most importantly, does the government have the consent of the governed? I'm not talking about just mere elections. Does the government have the consent of the governed? Or is the government authoritarian, incompetent, parochial, fragile, etc.? Does the state have the monopoly for the use of force, or subgroups have grabbed the force in the country? And the fourth ingredient, the last one, is the state capable of confronting outside interests and influence, both political and economic? Weaker, fragile states, of course, will succumb to the regional and global pressures that we've seen in all Arab countries. I'm afraid countries in the region in deep crisis or conflict do not meet these four key ingredients. In essence, the root causes of the protracted conflict we have witnessed for years in the past decade and more. And let me stop here and maybe continue on some of these points later in the question and answer period. Thank you very much for having me.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Actually, your 4 points were very curious and very peculiar and very interesting. I do think that they will arouse a lot of discussion. So instead, saying that, I'd like to pass the floor to our next speaker. Very well known in Russia and elsewhere, the Middle East expert Alistair Crook, Director Conflicts Forum.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, let me pass the greetings from Italy to you in Moscow. And thank you very much for the invitation. Modernity. Modernity and the Middle East historically have never made for comfortable bedfellows. Nor has this tense cohabitation been altogether an uplifting experience. Far from it. It has been hugely disruptive. It has encompassed enforced population transfers, the disembedding of people from community, from culture, from their soil, all in the name of modernity. In short, the structures of the Middle East today are largely the sum effects of the myth of universal values, of Westification and postmodernity imposed onto diverse civilizations and old cultures. Today, the Western establishment is implementing a double reboot to its legitimizing myth. They call it a reset. It is indeed an update to its operating system, no longer so much focused on democracy and on freedom. That narrative is being quietly retired. No. Biden, the EU, and Davos today are leading a massed cavalry charge to save the planet from climate change. This is at the crux of the Western myth reset. Less democracy, now widely perceived as everywhere rigged, but rather with America leading the world to fight CO2, carbon dioxide, the pandemic, and heading a reboot of the global monetary system. Establishment universal values have been updated too, in line with the new mission. The new, more sensitive establishment operative is fiercely opposed to white supremacy, to racial and social inequality, and otherwise wholly committed to the green agenda, and to enforcing gender and identity rights across the globe. This represents a huge shift from the small team at the Council on Foreign Relations, who in the early 1940s sought an American imperialism based not on the discredited British or French literal colonialism, but one rooted in virtue signaling universal values and backed by massive firepower. Today, however, even neoliberal Wall Street is being rebooted as well. It is being greenwashed. It is now doing socially, environmentally, and financially responsible investing, called ESG. Or so they would have you believe. What might this reset portend? Nominally, the American-led order will change. Yes, but control stays. Only it will be a control that is defined through rules, fines, and sanctions connected to CO2 emissions and on identity rights, broadly interpreted, gender rights, identity rights, and lapses in those. Should this reset succeed, and it is by no means assured, its potential disruption to the Middle East region may rival that of the earlier 19th century. The US has a variety of tools at its disposal to enforce its climate goals. Biden already speaks of the use of carbon tariffs, fees, or quotas on carbon-intensive goods from countries that are failing to meet their climate and environmental obligations. Climate would thus provide the Biden administration with a new means to pursue the America First agenda. As Biden said during his campaign, countries that fail to meet their climate responsibilities won't be allowed to erode global progress with cheap, carbon-dirty goods, unquote. But there is much more to this toolbox. Climate goals, as does the woke rights agenda, provide ample justification for strong interventions into the domestic politics of nations, including support for selected parties, social movements, and NGOs. Some Middle East states may choose to try and sit on the sidelines to see how this plays out. And re-establishing a global imperial class today would probably require the US to force a psychologically searing defeat upon the Russia-China-Iran axis, otherwise Mackinder's World Island. One, a defeat which might legitimize, again, the Western myth, or re-legitimize the Western myth. This does not seem a likely prospect in the wake of what happened at Anchorage last week. A contrary outcome may be possible, with the post-war mold cracking. But for now, we have bifurcation ahead. Some Middle East states are already going down with the Davos reset map, concentrating their economies within a tight, controlling operational circle. And they are embracing the Davos mantra of the fourth industrial revolution, in which AI, robots, and tech change the world as a supply-side miracle. However, these variables, these ESG variables, which mix climate, community, and diversity values, really essentially give Wall Street a brilliant hook on which to gin up investor enthusiasm for believing they are fixing the world by investing in these ESG stocks, when instead they are just making Larry Fink and Jamie Dimon much richer. With Western economies becoming more and more make-believe, and as existing market bubbles falter, a new bubble, a green bubble, will need to be blown to save Western financial markets. The greenwashing hysteria is little more than a distraction from the implosion occurring in much of our real economy. It's compulsion. The compulsion of this narrative is easily understood. After all, who would possibly be against fixing the climate, even if it costs quadrillions, or rather, especially if it costs quadrillions, because in one fell swoop, central banks can assure themselves carte blanche to print as much money as they would ever need. This is supposedly to save the economy. But these aspects may seem far off to some, who will not unduly worry about them. But they should, and this applies widely across the region. Proponents of green policies have long warned of the failure to appreciate the radical impact of a quadrillion fuel transition to CO2-free energy, one that would leave in its wake a huge overvaluation of stranded fossil fuel assets in a highly distorted market, their underlying value having evaporated. In 2019, the Bank of England governor practically pleaded with investors to drop their financial exposure to fossil fuels. Quotes, up to 80% of global coal assets and up to half the world's proven oil reserves could become stranded assets as the world moves to curb carbon emissions and as supplies of clean, renewable energy continue to replace fossil fuels, unquote. Bottom line, these climate sets to modernity, these climate resets to modernity will be highly disruptive. So too will be the bifurcation caused by the Rimland trying to force acquiescence on the heartland. Secondly, the dilapidation of the modernity narrative, the Western modernity narrative, as the one blueprint for all, leaves a huge void. A void which demands Middle East societies should devise updates to their national legitimizing myths to offer new community cohesion. Perhaps these can be found through reaching back to ancient cultural archetypes, and also to find better solutions to raw neoliberalism, which has not served well the region's peoples. Thank you very much.
Благодарю вас, Алистер Крук.
Thank you, Alistair Crook. You connected very well the problems of the region with the global problems. For sure, it will bring about comments and questions that we will ask later. And now, let me give the floor to our final presenter of this session, Nikolai Surkov, Senior Research Fellow, Center for Middle East Studies, Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations, where Irina Zagorska is president. Thank you very much. Let me thank the Valdai Discussion Club for this opportunity to speak here and to share my observations regarding the situation in the region. I was listening to the previous speakers very carefully. There were a lot of sharp and bright and vivid statements, but let me focus on something else. Now we are witnessing only the beginning. At best, we are in the first third of a long-term transformation of the Middle East. The problems that were the cause of protests of 2011 are still with us. This is confirmed by revolts and rallies and regime changes in such countries as Algeria, Sudan, Lebanon, Iraq, something that happened relatively recently in 2019. Now, the question is, what will happen to the crisis in the region? What is going to happen to states that are trying to survive there? A lot has been said about that it's hard to build democracy that easily in those countries, because in those countries there's no middle class, or they lack necessary democratic institutions. And also we noticed that a successful transit in Tunisia was the result of a unique combination of factors which never happened again anywhere else in the Middle East. You cannot expect fast democratization anywhere. If that is true, you have to look for alternative solutions and try to understand how they might look like. Maybe there will be some intermediary approaches, and so far practice has shown that in a situation of crisis that we witness in the region, people will follow those parties, leaders and groups that will be able to feed them and give them satisfy their basic needs in security, utilities, healthcare services. That's what we're talking about. Joost Helterman this morning spoke about the crisis of legitimacy in the region. That's one of the main problems for the political systems that we have there. I also have to say that those regimes that use monarchy as legitimacy turned out to be quite stable. You could see it even in 2011. They used traditional institutions. On top of that, monarchies have fairly significant financial resource. If we talk about other countries, the electoral legitimacy sometimes is only formal in the Middle East, and it is only necessary for recognition of the international community. In today's situation, political systems will be more in demand if they're based on charisma or popularity and prestige of a specific individual. This is where we are going to most probably. And we see saviors of motherland, protectors of faith. People like that will come to power. This is what we are to expect in the nearest future. Why do I keep talking about that? Because according to politology classics, Max Weber, Antonio Gramsci, were all saying then that crises lead to the appearance of charismatic leaders, and when charismatic leaders come up, it's the result of a crisis. It can be a result of some schism or separation in society, some external threat or disintegration of the country. And all these situations is what we witness now in the region. There is a probability that we will once again see some vivid new Caesars, so to speak. They use this term, Caesar-like leader. And again, we're talking about charismatic personalities who have extraordinary qualities and who are supported by the population. That's why we can only hope, and that's an important point. Most probably such regimes will come up, and there are a number of countries where we can expect them. Libya, we are almost there. If you look at Khalifa Haftar, if it can be Sudan, where there will be a new wave of fighting for power. It can be Iraq, where the situation is quite unpredictable. We only need to understand here what kind of charismatic leadership we're going to get. Will that be a charismatic, conservative charismatic leader who will protect the status quo, or will it be a more progressive charismatic leader? And again, if we can hope for charismatic leaders, then it gives us hope for some changes, because charismatic leaders never play by the rules. They go against the precedents. What can we say with regards to the Middle East here? We have witnessed two generations of such charismatic leaders. First in the 1950s and 60s, mostly are those who had some army in the background. This is what Prince Turkey was talking about the ambitious officers who came to power through coup d'etats, but the charismatic leaders ensured modernization of the region in the 1950s and 1960s, modernization of their countries, switched to republican form of government, industrialization. They built new political systems. Yeah, well, it is true they were not ideal, but it was not a new step forward in the development of Arab world. Then there came a next generation of charismatic leaders that were quite conservative. They limited themselves to cosmetic changes. They would deal with some obvious problems of their regimes, but they still existed. And interestingly enough, evolution of those regimes took place sometimes instead of military structures. It was based on other structures. Sometimes there was Ministry of Interior or some pro-government parties. But what is important and what we're witnessing today, the crises are not over. They're getting worse because of political, economic, and natural reasons. It was mentioned at least 5 times today. And what we can expect now in this crisis, it's unavoidable that we are going to see the appearance of new charismatic leaders. People in the region, let's consider the special features of this region, they don't vote for any kind of party program. In the Middle East, they vote for a specific person, for a person whom they trust, whom they want to rely on. And once again, we get new forces then that can act as kingmakers, not necessarily the army. Sometimes there are powerful political groups with their own armed forces, and the oligarchs who can change the situation. Altogether, it means that we will most probably have a new third generation of such charismatic leaders. And we only need to understand here why this can be the solution. You cannot expect democracy. Charismatic leaders at least can give you some kind of progress, some kind of modernization. And I personally am moderately optimistic because of this demand for democratization, both within and from the outside. We can get a situation where these new charismatic leaders, new leaders of the region, will pay more attention to the electoral type of legitimacy, and that will help us develop such important political institutions as political parties and parliaments. And then gradually we could switch to not just charismatic leaders, but rather party leaders, those who are brought up from the party circles.
Proceeding from that, we can identify a very interesting trend or tendency that now we're going to see some transitional period in which framework will see not so much the democratic transition, but rather, to some extent, we'll see the emergence of some political systems with the domination of strong charismatic leaders. And probably they're going to reshape the region. Otherwise, if that leadership is not progressive but quite conservative, we'll see more freezing of the problems and another cycle of protests, and the cycles of uprisings would go on and on. Thank you so much. We have listened to 5 outstanding pitches. I'd like to draw your attention to the last one, because Mr. Surkov said very important things which echo the keynote report in terms of the role of an individual in the Middle East and in the history. Therefore, we can ask some questions and express our opinions. So let's start Q&A session, or the free-flow discussion. I pass the floor to Mr. Bela Krunitsky. First of all, I'd like to thank once again the organizers of the Valdai Discussion Club for their kind invitation. I'm not a big expert in the Arab world. I'm dealing with Turkey and Iran, partially. Afghanistan and Pakistan also fall into the domain of my interest, but I was dealing with the demographic issues. Therefore, I'd like to react to what's been mentioned by Mr. Kreyer, Balian, Alistair Crook, and others, that the situation in the region is quite pessimistic. And pessimism is a very cheap commodity. It's very easy to be a pessimist. I studied demographic issues, but not very thoroughly. I'm not very knowledgeable about the Arab world, but I know that there is some U-turn which takes place on that issue. For instance, a change in the birth rate. I think that these countries no longer have the youth bulge and other problems. I think that these questions have to be seen in some context. Well, sometimes it was taken for granted, was taken without saying, but now I think that we have to look at the demographic issue more attentively. Unfortunately, during the discussion, we didn't have room to consider the migration of the workforce to the Arab regions, and this is a very serious problem which certainly has a ripple effect on the social composition of the hosting countries. And sadly, the role of a woman in the Arab world is related to the fact that lots of workforce is being employed in the oil-rich, fast-growing states of the Gulf and of the Arab world. I mean that we can see a big differentiation of the countries there. I do think that we have to use a differentiated approach to the region. All the questions related to demography are quite acute everywhere, but I think that we have to make such reservation. For instance, the birth rate in Turkey and in Iran are matching the one of Europe. Turkey is developing at a pace when actually the population grows 1.5 percentage points a year. The same is true of Iran, so it means that these countries already concluded the demographic transition. Certainly the problems are there, but can be addressed by the tendency itself. So it's self-healing problem. Some countries are successful addressing the problems which were mentioned today. This was my brief remark, but I have a question to Mr. Balian. He spoke about legitimacy of the state. He spoke about the people's consent to be governed, whether the people agree with the legitimacy of the state. How can you measure this consent for the state legitimacy? What methods can you use for that? Before I pass the floor to Mr. Balian, let me ask for more questions, and then our panelists will respond to all of them. Nikolai Plotnikov, this is our superstar from the Institute of Oriental Studies. Well, I have a question to all the four speakers. Remarkable and outstanding speeches in the Middle East. Well, starting from the Arab Spring, we saw a mushrooming of the non-state actors. I'm a career officer, and in my previous capacity, I had to fight against the consequences of that. What do you think about the root causes of the emergence of non-state actors? What we can do in order to prevent them from emerging? Thank you so much. Mr. Surkov's contribution was quite interesting in terms of charismatic individuals or personalities, charismatic leaders. And probably they will pop up eventually. But if we look at what was going on back in 2011, the Arab Spring, during that uprisings, which embraced 18 countries, can you name at least one charismatic leader that would be heading such an uprising? No, not a single one. When some leaders would come to power, it was not as a result of the popular uprising. The same was true of the uprisings of 2019. In none of the four countries, we do not see any charismatic leaders topping the uprising. Moreover, in Lebanon, popular uprisings dealt a blow on all the charismatic persons involved in the politics. In Iraq, among the Shias, it was also a blow dealt on all the charismatic persons, especially against Qasem Soleimani. That's a very peculiar story. I think that it contradicts the statement that some charismatic persons may come to power as a result of these uprisings. The current developments actually show the totally different trend. More questions? Vladimir Sezhny, over to you. I have a question to His Royal Highness. Royal Highness, yep, this is what I said. Turkey bin Faisal Al Saud. How does Saudi Arabia react to the development of the Iranian nuclear program from the standpoint of science and technology? I have a question to Alistair Crook. Is he online? Thank you so much for very interesting contribution with elements of philosophy and some focused. Actually, I cannot ask all the questions which I have on my mind, but still, all these talks about green energy, alternative energy, they are useful and good, but aren't there any attempts to somehow discipline the coal mining nations? Because I see a lot of criticism being staged against oil and gas producing nations. This alternative energy, is it an attempt to deal a blow against these nations? I think that your answer would be quite useful. And by the way, I would like to thank you for the remarkable analytic documents published by the Conflict Forum, which you published. It was very informative in terms of the Middle East. This is one of the best sources of information for us to understand what is going on there. Are there any more questions? So that I'm passing the floor to our esteemed speakers, starting with His Royal Highness. No, I apologize. There is one more question.
I find Nikolai's typology of leaders and figures quite interesting, in fact, especially that he quoted Max Weber, who, in fact, brought about this concept of, the historical legitimacy, charismatic legitimacy, and then the performance legitimacy. It's a very seminal concept in terms of political science. If I may just put other words on your models, I would say that we had in the Arab world, at least, or in the Middle East, several figures of charisma or of leaderships. You had the first generation, which is something like the 20s the 20s maybe of last century. People like Ataturk or Sharif Hussein or etc. that are, we can call them national bourgeoisie leaders who brought about the modern states in the Arab world or in the Middle East. Then you have a second generation, which is the coup d'etat generation, militaristic figures who probably brought their legitimacy from the field, from the army, Abdel Nasser, the Assads, Saddam, etc. Then you have Gaddafi, in a way, although he never fought to my knowledge. Then you have a third generation, which is the Islamic movement's figures. Khomeini in Iran, bin Laden, Muslim Brother leaders, etc. You can call them the prophets. And then you have the generation of the Arab Spring or the Arab Revolution, who is mainly social media and influencers people, the Wa'il Ghunaim, etc., in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq. And what, in terms of structure, if you can say that the anti-colonialism brought the first generation, militaristic developments and the Praetorianism brought about the second generation, Islamic development and Islamic upheaval brought about the third, and social media and new technology brought about the fourth. where will the fifth generation could take root? In what is the infrastructure of it?
Так, спасибо большое. Все-таки у нас...
Thank you so much. The organizers still have only 10 minutes left. Therefore, I kindly ask the speakers to answer the questions posed. Please be brief. Let's start with His Royal Highness Prince Turkey.
We could go on for hours, but I'll try to be brief. The Middle East definitely is going through a transition period, the Arab world particularly, but that is also true of the rest of the world. And if we see what is happening in the United States and Europe, their political institutions are under question by their own people. And there have been, as we've seen in the last American election, civil disorder and so-called accusations of vote rigging and so on. In Russia, for example, you just had the constitutional amendment that allows Mr. Putin to go on for another few years. In China, in the last Communist Party conference, more power was given to Xi Jinping, etc. And Europe, of course, is a hotbed of turmoil nowadays, not just because of COVID, but also because of the populist movements that are rising up in Europe. So I would say that we're not unique in the Arab world of being in political and state questioning turmoil. But nonetheless, we have to find solutions to our problems. And many of the solutions, of course, in my view, have to come from inside. They cannot be imposed from the outside. The issue of democratization, for example, cannot be forcibly imposed on any country in the world, especially when democratic countries themselves are not a good example of democratization. So that is something that we in the Arab world, and I think I can speak for Saudi Arabia, we look at to learn from what is happening in other places. As far as the energy sources that Mr. Crook mentioned, the kingdom has proposed the circular carbon economy as an alternative to the all-inclusive non-carbon-based proposals that have come about. And so I think Russia is equally involved in that program, and we've seen the close cooperation that is taking place between Saudi Arabia and Russia on energy matters. Double standards affect us all. And these double standards have prevailed in our part of the world for many years, and I think they're not acceptable. So let us not be so generalizing as perhaps Mr. Balian was about the Arab world, although initially he mentioned a few exceptions, particularly about the Gulf states and the difference they are from the other Arab world. But then generalization on youth bulge and so on is equally, I think, misleading. And on the question of women, I can give you examples of the kingdom. When the Vision 2030 began 5 years ago, the percentage of women in the labor force was 7%. Today, it is 25%. So you can see what can be done with proper planning and execution of plans. And let me just answer the last question about the Iranian nuclear program. The kingdom believes that developing a nuclear program requires the ability of the people of the kingdom to sustain such a program. So human capacity is very important. And in all the studies I've seen, to develop a proper nuclear program, you need at least 2 decades of developing human capacity in order to have a viable civilian peaceful nuclear program. And this is where the kingdom is going. And it has signed agreements with Russia, with China, and with other countries to do that. Charismatic leaders, we've all gone through issues of charismatic leaders. Russia today is an example of a charismatic leader who came at a time and did for Russia what the Russian people are very happy with. If I can just refer to Mr. Trump in America, he had charisma. And whether you agreed with him or disagreed with him, he had charisma. So it is not just a requirement for the Arab world to have charismatic leaders to have development, but it's a phenomenon that afflicts or perhaps helps societies in different places. And again, Yani, I thank the Valdai conference for allowing me to attend.
Спасибо большое, Ваше Высочество.
Thank you so much, Your Royal Highness. So in that, I'm passing the floor to Mustafa Aydin.
Since there was no direct question, to me, I'll take the case of mushrooming non-state actors in the region. And obviously, there are several root causes why they are mushrooming in the region, starting from non-representative governance in the countries, the feelings of discrimination for different groups within states, ethnic, religious differences, sectarianism, etc. But one particular aspect is quite important, is the international encouragement of such groups to, when they emerge or while they're emerging. We all know from the literature that without international support or encouragement, this kind of actors do not really succeed or do not survive for a long period of time. So if we are looking the root causes of non-state actors in the region, we have to look both within the states, the problems that we have been talking, and also outside the states who are encouraging these organizations or the institutions to come out. And final point regarding this, the leaderships in the region, and everybody keeps referring to this point. Obviously, it's not the problem of the Middle East only, as His Excellency highlighted. We have seen the similar developments across the world: populist leaders, charismatic leaders, authoritarian leaders, whatever you call them. I believe personally that they are not the solution for any of the problems of the Middle East, or let alone other countries. The solution to the regional problems goes through more representative governments, more governments which has legitimacy both inside their countries and from outside, from the international society. So let me stop here and also thank the Valdai conference again, allowing me to be one of the participants.
Спасибо вам большое. А теперь...
Thank you very much indeed. Now, Khmer Balyan.
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to Prince Turki for reminding us that the problems that we have discussed today are not only found in the Arab world, but also in the West. In fact, he's absolutely right when he says that look at the elections last year, last November in the US. It was a complete mess. There was half of the population who rejected the outcome of the election based on fake news, basically, but rejected. They believed it. So the so-called American exceptionalism has been completely debunked in the elections last year. There's another aspect to the U.S. role in what is going on in the Middle East, and that is the sanction. That is first and foremost the quick attempt to so-called quote-unquote advise other countries, quick and ill-advised attempts, and then to do regime change in around the world, in particular, and we know what is the outcome of that. We don't need to elaborate. One of the disasters in the East. Now, more direct on, the question asked to me, and how does one measure the legitimacy of authority? And I did not say the legitimacy of state, but legitimacy of authority. Of course, the litmus test for the legitimacy of authority, the classic litmus test, is elections. Election, people express their and elect who they think should govern the state in which they live. But let's not be too simplistic. There may be ways in which the legitimacy of authority can be measured, and there, of course, we're venturing into less tangible ways in which to measure the legitimacy. Unfortunately, time does not permit me to get into too much detail on this, but there too, there are ways in which one can measure the legitimacy of authority. One example is how free are the people? How freely can they exercise fundamental freedoms? And to what extent the jails of a given country are filled with thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of dissidents who are languishing in the jail. So there are many ways to measure the legitimacy of authority, but again, we can't go into it. And thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this very distinguished panel. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Ну, теперь Алистер Круг.
Thank you. Now, Alistair Crook.
Thank you. Well, we're all familiar with the phrase about American-led global order, rules-based order. And the point is that they're changing the rules. And they're doing it for political purposes and economic purposes. Because climate change engages the young. It brings, no one can really complain about capital. It becomes a sort of religion, a hysteria, and it also blocks out serious discussion about fuels, about fossil fuels and their place in this in the structure. Because it's all about getting rid of CO2, irrespective of the degree to which CO2 is a major factor in the climate. So it is, but it's a political exercise after Trump to restore what is called multilateralism or globalism. And of course, you see that not only the rules in terms of climate change and CO2 correctness, but even just today, we have seen the British Prime Minister with the French and the German saying we must have a new Bretton Woods for the pandemics that are going to come in the future. More rules, more regulations, more opportunity to impose rules and sanctions on non-compliant states. And then, of course, is the problem of the monetary system. More rules, more systems, global governance of the monetary system that is taking place. What I was trying to say to you, and I'll say it a bit more frankly, this greenwashing of the economy in America, which is being pursued by the hedge funds and certain banks, to bring about a sort of, if you like, a game, an AI-based gaming of variables that they can play and make money, selling carbon debits or carbon assets against gender deficits or gender assets and all of these things, which is what all of the big, if you like, hedge funds like BlackRock and others are insisting on for everybody now, not just the government, but it's from the financial elites. All this is just generating a hysteria, essentially to try and keep the economy going. It needs, as we spoke about earlier, really, the real economy is in a bad way. And so we need a new bubble, and the new bubble is going to be a green bubble. But it's basically, a lot of this is illusion. And it's illusion which sustains a political project, and it's an illusion, if you like, which sustains a massive expenditure by the United States. Trillions of dollars, 1.29 trillion we've just had, another 4 trillion. And just to be clear, some of the younger members of the Democratic Party in the United States say that's not nearly enough. Why not 10 trillion? We need 1 trillion a year for 10 years to change the climate. Well, why not 10? Why not 20? Why not 30? I mean, this is large sums of money which are going to go into green projects and is certainly going to distort the whole markets for fossil fuels on which the region depends so vitally for its economic prosperity. And I'm just pointing out this is a real problem facing the Middle East because it's going to change many things as this hysteria for greening investments, and all of the banks will not now invest in any project which is not socially acceptable, which is not environmentally acceptable, and which is not balanced in terms of gender, LGBTQ, etc. So these are changes that are going to, I think, affect the Middle East very much, the social aspects and not just the monetary aspects because the two go together. They've said very clearly that in future they will not consider projects that do not prove gender balance, also equity, all of these woke cultural effects. So this is the rebooting, if you like, from the globalists to overcome the 4 years of Trump that went before it, which were going in another way. And they're in a hurry, a big hurry, because the margins in both Congress and the Senate are razor thin. And in 22, there'll be new elections, and the Democrats could lose those. So Biden's a man in a hurry. So you'll find at least, we've had 1.9 being passed without any Republican votes. You'll have the next tranches being passed without any Republican votes. And this will be mostly, if you like, an exercise in rebooting Wall Street and the financial world. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое. А теперь слово Николаю Суркову.
And now to Nikolai Surkov. Just three quick remarks. First of all, to His Royal Highness Prince Turkey, Russia remains in Syria, but if Russia leaves Syria, Syria will become a failed state. Russia is trying to restore Syria, at least somewhat, to make it more independent, which is the result of actions of some countries of the region. Now about leadership, in response to my colleague Joseph, the source of the root of new leaders would be the aspiration of people to get stability. The new leaders will promise people food, security and stability. This kind of charismatic leaders will be able to come to power. And perhaps these will be Konrad Adenauers for the Middle East. I personally would like that to happen. Responding to my other colleague, whether there were charismatic leaders among opposition leaders, no, they were not there. But in my intervention, I emphasized that charismatic leaders mostly come from the military, or, as it happens now, they can be local oligarchs with powerful resources, something that will happen in Sudan in the nearest future. On this will be people who use groups that have money and armed forces. This may happen in Iraq, and this is what we are witnessing in the current situation. Thank you for your attention. I'd like to thank the Valdai Club for the opportunity to share my observations. I'd like to thank all of you, and especially our speakers for their excellent contributions. I'd like to thank all our audience, and we need to end our session today. Once again, I'd like to thank our speakers in particular. Let's thank our interpreters too.